I remember in this one town that a man dragged himself to our headquarters, and he looked bloody from top to bottom. His shirt, his pants, everything was soaked in blood, and he was very badly beaten up. He went into, I guess one of our GIs brought him to our headquarters, and the commander, the Captain Bate, called me in to translate for him. This man was a Russian, but he could speak German pretty well. He was a Russian. He was a slave laborer who was brought into Germany to work for the Germans in the fields, in the factories. There were actually, I think, millions of slave laborers in Germany by the end of the war, doing the work that formerly was done by men who were now in the army. Well, this man was horribly beaten up. I asked him who did it. Well, he was from a village just on the outskirts of this town, and he said that when they found out that the Americans were in the area, he stopped working. And his boss, his German boss, owner, I guess you could say, since he was a slave, ordered him to keep working. And he refused because, hey, no more Nazi regime. The Americans are in charge now. Well, this guy called in some of his neighbors, and they started to beat him up. And they beat him up. He told me that his wife got all upset and tried to stop the fighting, and somebody took a pitchfork and stuck her with a pitchfork. So he's very worried about what kind of shape she must be in now. He ran away and he escaped from that village and found his way to the city. I think it was Weiden in Bavaria, and told us his sad tale. Well, the Captain Bate looked at me and just said something like, "Go get him." And a number of the GIs in the unit had seen the man arriving and were waiting outside, wondering what the story was. So I came out, and I was a PFC, and some of these guys were sergeants, staff sergeants, corporals. They were all veterans, long veterans of the fighting. I was a rookie, but it was pretty obvious that somebody who had to take charge of this, somebody who could speak German. So about 8 or 10 of the guys volunteered to come along with me. We got 2 trucks, and we jumped into the trucks, and from the directions that he gave us, we went to this little village. It was getting pretty dark by the time we got there. We knew the address of the man who was the boss of the slaves, and we found his house, and we arrested him and asked him who else was involved in the beating of this Russian laborer. He took us to the next house and the next house and the next house. We made the rounds and rounded up all these people and sort of herded them in front of us until we finally got to one place where the original arrested man asked for permission to talk to me. I had to, of course, do all the talking and tell the people, come along, you're under arrest now. And this original owner of the slave said, I want permission to talk, to explain something. I said, okay, go ahead. And he said, the first 10 people that you arrested were involved in the beating of this man, but the ones after that had nothing to do with it. If you keep asking him, he's going to keep giving you names until the whole village is arrested, but they were not involved. So we checked out with some of the other people, and they agreed that we had all the guilty ones. Once we had to guard a ammunition train that was on fire. There was a whole trainload of small arms ammunition, and it was burning, apparently hit by a bomb. And we had to guard it against what? Well, keep people away so that they wouldn't be endangered, and also keep the German soldiers away so they couldn't grab a bunch of cases of machine gun shells or whatever. So that was kind of ticklish because as it was smoldering away, every few minutes you'd hear a bang and you knew that the shell was sent in one direction, the bullet in the other, and they went ricocheting along. So we maintained a safe distance from the actual train and just kept people away from the vicinity. Another time we had to guard a German army warehouse, which was loaded with apricot brandy, bottles of apricot brandy. And we got orders to keep everybody away from it. Well, word got around, and some of the colonels and majors sent their drivers to pick up a case of apricot brandy. Sorry, we're under orders from the general that we're not to allow anybody to have these any of these supplies. This is now property of the American Army, or I forget what. Then a couple of GIs would come and say, hey, can we have a bottle of that stuff? Yeah, just go ahead. But don't tell anybody. Leipzig. Leipzig was the biggest city we went to or went through with this unit. Leipzig is a big city in the eastern part of Germany. And it was an industrial center. It was a center of publishing. It had music and all kinds of cultural connections. Well, after Leipzig fell to the American troops, we arrived at the city. We were driven right out to a small labor camp outside of Leipzig. Now, I mentioned the forced laborers, the Russian who was one of a large army of forced laborers who were taken from their native countries and forced to work in Germany. This was a labor camp of that sort. Camp Erla, there were 300 people normally, worked in the factories and fields during the day under guard. Then they were taken back to the camp, which was a wooden building with electrically charged barbed wire around it. and with a machine gun, guards with machine guns, making sure that they couldn't flee from there. On this particular day, just before we arrived, the guards ordered all 300 people into the wooden building, nailed boards over the windows and doors of the building, poured kerosene over the top of the wooden building, and set it on fire with 300 people inside. This was not a concentration camp. It did not have any Jews or political prisoners or anything like that. It was strictly people who were kidnapped from various countries and were forced to work for Germany. About a dozen of the people in the building figured out a way of getting out of the building. They jumped into the latrine pit and groped their way to the outside. And when they emerged outside the building, they found the guards standing there with machine guns waiting for them and shooting them down. By the time we got to Camp Erla, all that was left of the camp was the barbed wire enclosure, a big pile of ashes where some 290 prisoners used to be, and where the building, of course, used to be, and about a dozen corpses strewn around the outside, inside the enclosure. I could never figure out, not then, not since then, why these guards felt they had to do that as their patriotic duty. Why couldn't they just have opened the gate when they realized that the Americans were going to arrive? Why couldn't they just have opened the gate and said, "Thanks, guys. Thanks for helping us. You can go home now. Go back to your families"? Why did they feel that their pride in their country demanded that they kill these poor people who had never done any harm? I can never understand that, just like so many other things that happened during World War II, during the Holocaust, that I simply cannot comprehend. There were many German soldiers trapped when Leipzig was taken by the American army, and now our job was to take them back to prisoner of war camps in the rear. The normal procedure was, once they were rounded up, we would take a load, about 20 of them, and onto the bed of a truck, 2.5-ton truck. Then 2 GIs were assigned for the task of taking these men, to a PW camp. 1 GI was the driver of the truck. The other GI was a guard who had to sit on top of the cab of the truck, facing the rear, facing the prisoners on the bed of the truck, with a rifle in his lap to make sure that none of them would jump out and run away. They were now officially prisoners. We loaded the truck, we took off. I was sitting on the truck, facing the prisoners, facing the rear, and the GI who was driving the truck drove at top speed, which was the only way the GIs were ever driving in the war, through the city of Leipzig with ruined buildings on both sides, all kinds of garbage and all kinds of ruins, bricks and stuff lying around on the street. Anyway, he was going at neck-breaking speed while I was looking at the prisoner, wondering, were any of them guards at Camp Erle? Were any of them my old classmates from Kontanz, people who went to the same school as I did? What kind of background did all these people have? And while I was holding on for dear life and watching, all of a sudden, several of the prisoners yelled at me, pointing up at something up ahead, which was, of course, behind me. And I instinctively ducked all the way down, and a low-hanging streetcar wire swooped right over my back. If I hadn't been warned by these German soldiers, I think I would have lost my head right at that point. And it felt very strange to have my life saved by my enemies. The Russian army had occupied the eastern half of Czechoslovakia. We had the western half of Czechoslovakia. And we tried to differentiate between those who were Nazis during the Nazi time and those who were not Nazis. The Russians in their zone were not nearly as careful as that. I think the Russian soldiers generally took whatever they wanted to take from whoever was there, Nazi or otherwise. We were trying to reestablish the democracy that existed in Czechoslovakia before the war. Czechoslovakia was probably the most democratic country in Europe, the strongest democracy in Europe before World War II. The Russians immediately went to work converting the local population in their zone to the wonders of communism. And of course, they established the governments, local governments in their zone with trusted former communists wherever they could find them. When the decision was made that Czechoslovakia should again be independent, the United States simply withdrew all their troops from their zone of Czechoslovakia, and turned it over to the local democratic, hopefully, government. The Russian troops pulled most of their troops out of their zone, but they converted some of their political officers into civilians who then stayed behind and made sure that the local government would stay under the influence of the communist government. And in that way, the western part of Czechoslovakia turned out initially to have a return to democracy, whereas the eastern part of Czechoslovakia was solidly communist. There were also cases of anti-communists fleeing to our zone and then being kidnapped and taken back to the Russian zone. It was a very unfortunate situation. We had come to consider the Russian army, the Soviet army, as our allies, and of course they had the most brutal fighting of the war, of World War II. They lost, I've heard the number of 20 million soldiers, or people generally, I guess, during World War II. So they definitely had the tremendous losses fighting against the Nazis. And we would have been in very bad shape if we didn't have our Russian allies. But the way they treated their occupied zones after the war was over did not make many friends among the American soldiers. They were strictly political in that time, and rather brutally so. After the war was over, I was transferred into military government, special branch it was called, which was concerned with denazification. Consider the fact that Germany had to become a new nation. We had to get rid of the Nazi influence. We had to reestablish democracy in some way, a democracy which existed before Hitler came to power, but which never was very successful, never had much of a chance to be successful, because they had to clean up the damage after World War I. They were stuck in a horrible inflation. They were stuck in a horrible depression. They never really had a chance to show what a democracy can do. And now we had to reestablish a democracy, which to some extent was considered as having been a failure before Hitler's ascension to power. We had to make sure, the special branch part of military government had to interview, question all applicants for jobs in the German police force, German government, German schools, all strategic work to make sure that the Nazis, the fanatical Nazis who ran this show in the previous 12 years would not get back into those important positions. So anybody applying for any important job in the government or in public service had to be screened by special branch. We had one of the first things we did when we took various cities was to grab all the documents that we could. The party records, the SS records, the Gestapo records, industrial records, and so forth, in anticipation of this task. And we had a document center that had all this information of people who lived and worked in the lower Bavarian region where we were located. We had excellent records. Very interesting records we had was from war factories, from war plants that where reliable people were given jobs to make guns and tanks and planes and things. And in order to qualify for these jobs, they had to fill out application forms and prove that they were loyal Nazis. And they had to give all kinds of information about what organizations they belonged to and what they did for the fatherland and things like that, and show by documents that they were reliable Nazis. Well, we seized all those records, and each one of them had a notarized signature of the person. So somebody would come in and say, oh, I hated those Nazis. I'm so glad you guys came along and rescued us. Thank you very much for getting rid of those dirty so-and-sos. And then we'd say, well, fill out this form right here. And the form had about 50 Nazi organizations listed. And for each one, they had to say yes or no, whether they belonged to it and whether they were in a leading position in that organization. And then we compared those forms with the documents that we had in the document center. And a lot of people got into trouble. Unfortunately, this was not a perfect procedure. Well, for one thing, it was all organization-oriented, and people who did all kinds of nasty murdering or other bad work for the Nazis, but did not join any of the organization, they were more or less exempt unless there were specific denunciations against them from victims who wanted them to pay for what they did. And more importantly, anyone who came from another part of Germany, particularly from a part that was occupied by the Soviets, or who were ethnic Germans who lived in Czechoslovakia, which had a very strong Nazi movement that led to its being taken over by Hitler. And in parts of Russia and Poland, there were many ethnic Germans who were really Nazis, strong Nazis, fanatical. Anyone who came from Eastern Europe or from the Soviet zone of occupation was automatically exonerated because we had no documents on their lives, and any requests that we made to those zones for any of the officials to check up on these people who were applying for work in our area were simply ignored. We never got any cooperation from any of the Soviet authorities in response to our requests. So anyone who came from Silesia, which was taken over by Poland, or from Eastern Europe generally, where East Germany, which was occupied by the Soviets, we had no way of knowing whether they were or were not Nazis, unless they happened to be recognized by someone in town who came from the same area and who wanted to get them into trouble. So this was army work again that I was doing, but I guess I never did really have much use for the rifle that I got my training with, except to keep it in my lap and to carry it when I was going on patrol duty in towns that had fallen to our forces. After the war was over, our unit got a request from American intelligence. I guess it was CIC, the Counterintelligence Corps. They needed people who could speak German as translators or interpreters. And they wanted to borrow a translator, an interpreter, for one day for a specific job. I was asked if I don't know if I was asked or I was just told, this is your assignment for tomorrow. I was given a typhus injection, vaccination. There were typhus outbreaks, especially in the camps near the end of the war. And so they gave me a typhus injection and then drove me to Camp Flossenburg, which was a big concentration camp in East Bavaria, a part of Germany. When I arrived there, I was instructed that my job would be to question two kapos. Two kapos. A kapo is himself a prisoner in a camp, in a concentration camp in this case, who is put in charge of a group of other prisoners. So these two kapos, some of the kapos being themselves prisoners, were very sympathetic with the people they were put in charge of and tried to help them any way they could without being caught helping them. But there were, most of the kapos were not very cooperative with the prisoners, or not very kind to the prisoners. In fact, they tried to prove that they were just as vicious as the SS guards in order that they could keep their jobs as kapos. And so they had to outdo the SS guards in brutality. And these two kapos were accused of being of that kind. Also, something that a lot of people don't know is that the first occupants of concentration camps were violent repeat offenders, criminals who killed people and who did very serious crimes repeatedly. And instead of keeping them in prisons, they put them in concentration camps, and they were preferred candidates for this job of a kapo, to put in charge of other prisoners. Well, I had the first kapo brought in to the room where I was sitting, and I started out by asking some pretty simple, innocuous questions like, where was he born? How old is he? What kind of job did he have before he came to the camp? Then I got to the real questions. What kind of assignment did you have in the camp? Well, I was put in charge of a group of prisoners who worked in the stone quarry. They worked in the stone quarry. What kind of work did they do in the stone quarry? Oh, they had to move rocks, big rocks around. They had to cut them up with a hammer and chisel. They had to move the broken rocks, load them onto wagons, and carry them from one place to another. Sounds like pretty hard work. Yes, very hard work. Okay. Did you ever kill anybody who worked for you? Yes. More than one? Yes. How many do you think you killed? Oh, 8 or 10, maybe 12, maybe, I don't know, maybe more. I didn't keep count, didn't keep track. Why did you kill them? Oh, always for a good reason. They didn't follow the rules. Didn't follow what rules? What, for example, what were some of the rules? Oh, usually they didn't work hard enough. They knew that they had to work hard. They had to work hard. There was no choice about that. And if they didn't work hard, no, they had no choice. Had to kill them. Or if they didn't keep clean. You killed some people because they didn't keep clean? That's right. How did you kill them? Oh, usually with a rock or with a club. Do you feel that a person who doesn't keep clean under these conditions deserves to be killed? He looked at me as if I was particularly dense. He said, well, that was the rule. They didn't follow the rules, so they had to take the consequence. Well, I had him taken away and had the other prisoner come in, the other capo brought in, asked him the same questions. He came up with the same answers. Neither of them had any regrets, any remorse, had any feeling of guilt. Neither of them felt that they had done anything wrong. For both of them, killing a human being was absolutely trivial, meant nothing to them. I turned my report in to the commanding officer and told him what I had found. I never found out what happened to the kapos. Went back to my unit. But whenever I came across somebody like the kapo, somebody like the guards or the work of the guards at Camp Erla, my thoughts always went to our relatives that we had left in France. My mother's sister, my aunt, her husband, and their teenage daughter lived in France during peacetime. We had lost contact with them. We had no idea what happened to them. Later, we found out that they had been arrested by French police, rounded up. They were working under German orders. They were rounded up, taken to a camp in Paris. From there, they were sent to Auschwitz concentration camp, and they were killed at Auschwitz. Whenever I saw the work that the Germans had done during what we now refer to as the Holocaust, I always worried. Of course, my family was very much worried as word came out of what the true extent, the scope of the horror that the Nazis had committed in not only Germany, but in their occupied countries. Always we worried, and of course our worries were well-founded. We got the bad news after the war. Had we stayed in Kontanz, had we not been able to get out when we did, our fate would probably have been the same as the fate of those of the Jewish community who stayed behind, who were not able to get out. Most of them were killed. I think it was in 1941, all the Jews from South Germany were rounded up, sent to a collection camp in southern France, or several collection camps. And from there, they were systematically, those who did not die from the natural conditions at those camps, which were horrible, they were systematically shipped to the death camps of Poland and were murdered there, for the only reason being that they were Jewish. Men, women, children. Could it have been that only Jewish criminals were killed? No, some 1.5 million children, 14 years old and younger, were killed in the Holocaust as enemies of the German nation. Children all the way down to toddlers, newborn babies. They were all considered a danger to the German people. How thousands of people could have been involved in that kind of killing spree, in that kind of procedure, and come out every night thinking that they did their duty to their country, that this was their patriotic duty to protect the German nation from the enemy. I will never be able to understand. And of course, the big enabler of this whole thing is not the thousands, not just the thousands who were doing the killing, but the millions of Germans, the millions of people in other countries who either collaborated in this effort or simply turned their backs on it. The way I like to phrase it is that 65 million Germans did not become 65 million murderers. They became 65 million bystanders who knew damn well what was going on and didn't do anything about it.